Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second webinar as part of our annual symposium. Today, we're going to be focused on research and campaigns regarding LGBTQ people and education. This is really important work, research, and we really wanted to highlight this in this year's symposium about how important research is to campaign organizing, to movement building. And so we have some fantastic folks who are going to join us today. And I wanted to be able to introduce them to you so you can learn from them as well as the work that they're doing. So Nicole Young-Turner, founder and principal consultant at Kaleidoscope Village. Thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it. Siljestrom, associate director, Safe and Healthy Schools, Equality Florida. Thank you for being here today. We also have Brianna Jameson, LGBTQ youth activist and chair of the 2019 GSA Banneker High School, and also an entrepreneur. So really appreciate you being here today as well. And unfortunately, Mason wasn't able to join us today, but Mason's an LGBTQ youth advocate and transgender activist doing some incredible work. And I'm sure you'll be hearing about his work in the future. And of course, we have Ashlei Rabess, who is a doctoral student in the Counselor Education and Practice program at Georgia State University, is also one of our fellows. So thank you, Ashlei, for being here today. And Ashley's going to be leading a lot of the questions. I'll jump in as well. But again, just to kind of set the stage, we as an institute are conducting currently a survey in the South of LGBTQ Southerners. And the need for research is vast in terms of LGBTQ people not being seen in research. And so we're trying to fill that gap. And so today we really wanted to zero in on education organizing, especially for LGBTQ people, and research and how that can aid that work. But let's get into that. Ashlei, if you want to start the questions.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you so much, Ryan. Do we want to unshare the screen so that our attendees can see the faces of our panelists really well? Okay.
There we go.
So thank you, Ryan, for those introductions. I wanted to give the audience a little bit more information about our panelists so they know kind of who we're talking with and what their experiences are as far as our topic for today goes. So if you could all just kind of take a moment and share with us your background when it comes to LGBTQ research and education, and a little bit more about what you do, and in no particular order.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. I will start. My name is Nicole Young-Turner, and I am currently the founder of Kaleidoscope Village, which is an organization, an education consulting firm, working directly in schools and in the community to support LGBTQ inclusivity and empowerment for our youth. I have about over a decade as an educator as well as teacher trainer. And it is just absolutely important that we have really true data and representation to not only uplift and elevate our stories, but also drive real ground floor change. So thank you so much for having me here today.
I'll go ahead. So my name is Siljestrom. I'm really appreciative to be a part of this space and to share some of the work that we're doing and have this conversation. But so our organization, Equality Florida, we specifically, are working in the state of Florida, Intuitive. But our Safe and Healthy Schools department, we specifically are working with school districts to help them understand how to best systematize supports and best practices for our LGBTQ plus youth. And so, being able to utilize and lean on research to help navigate those conversations is critically important to be able to, not just, get our foot in the door in a lot of these communities, but also help to really paint the picture as to why this is important. And so in just the past about 4.5 years that our department's been around, we've been able to train 30,000 principals, assistant principals, counselors, social workers, school psychologists, deans, school resource officers, and of course, teachers. And so, we're really looking at it from a systems change type work. And I'm excited to just share a little bit more of what we're doing throughout today, but thank you again for having me.
My name is Brianna Jameson. I'm 20 years old, and I am so glad to be a part of this panel. This is new for me if I seem jitterish, but this is new. And I'm here to be a voice of the advocate of why being that LGBT students may need more help in the academic environments, because more so it's overlooked a lot of the times. And that's what I'll be here for, speaking for on behalf of my community, and hopefully they can relate to some things I also share. And two, I am here because I plan in the making of making a youth program, and this will be very helpful with seeing what is needed in areas I may not have thought of while hearing from other, very much important people in the room. So thank you for having me here also.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And Brianna, I hope that you know you're also one of the important people in this virtual room, and we definitely value your perspective. So thank you all for those further introductions. I wanted to get into some of our questions. And before I do that, I wanted to remind our attendees that if you'd like to pose a question to the panelists, whether it be individually to a specific person or to the group in general, you can do that through the Q&A feature on your Zoom platform. So feel free to do that. And if we have some time at the end, then we'll be sharing some of the audience questions. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into our questions for the panel today. And we've been talking a little bit about kind of like what you all are doing in the education space and how research kind of is incorporated into that. We wanted to ask the question, how important is education data to movement organizing in schools and colleges? So really, what is the importance of this, and like how does that measure up when we think about the work that we do in schools? And again, in no particular order, you don't have to go in the same order as last time, but when you feel so compelled to speak.
Guess I'll start again. As just from the lens of an educator and a youth development leader, like education data is so important. Data truly drives huge decisions that impacts our students' lives. So, from the way, we interact with families, from the way, our schools are even created and designed, up to what Ian mentioned, this systems level impact as far as policy change and shift. The data is absolutely important. To Brianna's point, oftentimes LGBTQ youth and families and people are left out of that data. And so decisions are being made, that are not necessarily inclusive of this community. And so when I think about just the importance of data, it is just absolutely the foundation that we need to truly move initiatives forward.
Mm.
I definitely agree with what you shared, Nicole. And my background is as a teacher as well. Before I was in this role, I was an elementary school teacher, Duval County Public Schools. And being in the classroom, being in a school that was a tested subject, right? We, how to make the grade, everything else. Every decision was data driven. I mean, I could not decide what lesson I taught in my class without it being connected to Florida State standards. And so with that knowledge that every single decision within a school district is based on data, when we look at, how do we create supports to be in place for our LGBTQ plus youth, if we aren't coming from that same approach, right, I think it's really easy for our work and what we're doing to be discredited, especially because when we talk about supporting LGBTQ plus youth, that's oftentimes seen as controversial or political or any of these different things. And so, with that knowledge and with the research that is out there related to the experiences of our youth, oftentimes when I'm doing a training, I'll tell people, we cannot make our decisions based on perception, right? We can't make our decisions based on how, things aren't the same. Kids are so much more affirming. It's not a problem anymore. Like, it's not a thing, right? Or I don't have LGBTQ kids in my school. It's not a thing. Whatever it is. I tell people we can't be driven by our perception. We have to be driven by what the data shows. And what it's showing is our students are still, vastly having different experiences at school compared to their heterosexual peers. And simultaneously, what we hear from our kids as well is, we hosted a conference and we allowed youth to where youth were a part, right? They had a session as a part of this conference, and they named their session, and they specifically named it More Than a Statistic, Resiliency of LGBTQ plus Youth. And so there is a balance of elevating what the data shows and elevating the needs of our students, while simultaneously making sure that people still understand the queer community is incredibly resilient. And our lives aren't dictated by the data alone, but it is something that we'll play the game too if it means that we can make systems change related to supporting our kids.
That was great. And to kind of pick back off of what you said about data being inside of schools, it will start a help of knowing who is in your building, just period. Because like I said, it's being overlooked. So when I was in school, I never had really, harassment issues or bullying in reverse to that, because them probably the topics people are ordinarily thinking about when they come to LGBTQ, and that's not true. It's more so of the principles and the policies of what we can and can't do, what we can wear and cannot wear, our affiliation. Sometimes you're not allowed to wear certain shirts that represent that community, and it's like, offensive of that, and also of major things like graduation. What can you wear in your graduation photo? Can you wear the pearl, or do you have to wear, the certain policy standard of what the school make you have to? And it makes us as students feel like we're not important, or we have to still yet hide who we are for somebody else to feel comfortable. And that's not what drives students, and it makes it feel like, yeah, we're overlooked, and that's not fair. So I feel like data in schools are important in that situation.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing that. It certainly helps to kind of orient me to our conversation, and I hope that our listeners are having a similar experience. And I appreciate the diversity of the experiences here. This is really, really awesome. I'm loving this dialogue so far. So my next question for the panel is about Glsen. So if you're not familiar with Glsen, for those that are listening, Glsen is the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network, and Glsen is known for their annual school climate survey, amongst other amazing things. And I was wondering for you all, based on interactions or collaborations, or even just like how you have benefited from the research that Glsen does. It's one of the largest surveys of its kind, and I wanted to kind of hear from you about in what ways Glsen's research has been helpful to you in your work. So let's go with that. Glsen's research, how has it been helpful to you? What is it like in using that data?
So Nicole, I'll go first so we don't make you keep having to go first. So the thing that's really great about the school climate survey from Glsen is not only does it have national data, but it also breaks it down for each state, which is incredibly helpful, right? Because we're able to see the experiences of directly our students. The other thing that's powerful about the survey is of the student survey, there's a really large population of trans and non-binary students who take it. And so because a lot of the state and national data doesn't necessarily always point to the experiences of our trans and non-binary youth, being able to lean on the Glsen survey to help further elevate our students' experiences and give you that snapshot of what school has been for them too, is I think really important. Now, with that said, we probably don't rely on Glsen so much as we rely on the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is also national data, which also has it broken down by states, but also even has it broken down by individual school districts. So, and you're probably gonna hear me keep saying Florida, so please forgive me, but that's where I do my work. But in a lot of the different states, there'll actually be individual school districts that have their own YRBS data. Why I think it's important is because, when we think of, again, people are quick to write off of the work of LGBTQ plus, programs, policies, initiatives, et cetera. But if you're able to point to a national survey that is conducted by, the CDC and managed by Department of Educations in individual states or school districts, it gives that real credibility, that real accuracy, et cetera. And with Glsen, when we look at who was surveyed in Florida, although the survey is, very inclusive of trans and non-binary folks, it also was 59% white. And so it absolutely is not representative of the students that make up Florida public school districts. And so, there is a balance of pulling in data from various sources so that you can, get the most accurate representation of your students and the students we serve.
Ian, I am so happy you went first because you brought up some really amazing points. Being in this work for as long as I have, and again, not longer than most folks, Glsen was really important and still is really important because, prior to, the Glsen survey, there wasn't much work focused on, school climate and school environment. So for that, I am just absolutely grateful. And to Ian's point, the localization is amazing because we get to really hone in. However, I do think that the youth risk behavior survey, as well as some of the newer HRC surveys, and including the Southern survey, does a really great job of amplifying intersectional experiences, right? So, us really being able to look at the experiences of our LGBTQ folks in Latinx communities or in African-American communities and really layer in those cultural impacts as well has been really important to my work, especially as we focus on our underserved communities and our communities of color. Another point that Ian brought up that I think Glsen has been doing really well and that I appreciate as a practitioner is truly being able to connect LGBTQ student data to these larger conversations that are happening about educational equity, right? And so really often we have discussions around, educational equity, what it looks like to ensure that all of our students are achieving and have opportunities. And then we talk about LGBTQ students off to the side. And I think, these types of research initiatives truly bring LGBTQ student experiences to the forefront, but also integrate them with these larger conversations around race, around class, around just creating, economic and achievement opportunities for our students.
I don't have much to say off of that. That's some pretty tough stuff. But I'm not a teacher, never been in that position, never really had to know these certain things in particular to be a help of their students and their communities. But just hearing off the two feedback, I can already feel in the making that if this is what can happen, it will be a great thing. Because even on job apps, I know it's not the topic, but education and surveys, they don't mention much about sexual orientation and how they can make those certain people feel more comfortable in that environment. So that is
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate all of your responses. And something that you mentioned earlier, Brianna, made me think about, it made me connected to something that Ian mentioned about how we do get this individualized, state specific, even sometimes district specific data that can help us to understand that the LGBTQ community at large, it's at large, right? There are sub communities and each district, each school, has a different kind of culture to it. And we can't treat each different community as if we're mutually exclusive. So I appreciate you sharing that, Brianna, because I think that you bring home the point that we do have differences even within our communities. Mm-hmm. And that's something I'm even working to correct myself from calling it LGBTQ communities, plural, because the differences are there and we have to pay attention to them. So thank you all. Did you want to jump in, Ryan?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I really appreciate the different surveys that are out there. And in particular, I wanted to just chat momentarily about Glsen as well, in terms of it's a survey specifically reaching out to LGBTQ populations and getting especially young people to be willing and interested in sharing their story through data. Because I think that's been one of the issues that we've dealt with within our Southern survey, and just looking at the lack of data around LGBTQ people in general. A lot of times we're not asked our opinions. or we're hidden in data. They don't know that we're LGBTQ. They don't know our experience. So to have a survey that, for example, that Glsen is doing with younger populations and getting them used to and comfortable with sharing their story through data is really helpful for us as an institute when we start to survey young adults and older adults about their life experiences. And I think that's just really important. I think it kind of goes to one of our questions, you know, in terms of how important is it for us all to participate in surveys that are valid surveys that are done, you know, ideally with an institutional review board. So for example, with our Southern survey, we work with Emory University to ensure quality, to make sure that we are not putting anybody at risk. And so we have to go through a whole process to show what we're doing to make sure people are okay when they take our survey. And so, you know, not saying that every survey is of the same caliber, but getting folks used to taking surveys that are of high quality that could help them share their story. Because I think that the end of it is making that connection about, well, why do we need to do that? And it's about the fact that that could tie to, for example, especially with YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, Ian, that you mentioned, and HRC and others, those could potentially inform policies that directly impact our lives. And so I just think it's really important to have that question about, you know, how important is it to have us participate in these surveys? Well, you know, for the first time, we're starting to be heard.
Absolutely. I think we can lean into that question. So I wanted to hear from the panel. So Ryan, thank you for bringing that up. Why is it important for LGBTQ people to participate in research? We know like what these risks are, and we know that oftentimes it can bring up a lot for folks participating in research and the mistrust between research figures and communities with LGBTQ communities and other minorities. Why is it important for us to participate in research?
I guess I could speak. It's important because you wouldn't know until you know. Like you wouldn't have a step until you take the step. And it seemed like, you know, it's like that phrase where you could take a horse to the pond, but you can't make it drink the water. Y'all do y'all part, like in the institute of making the survey.
Uh-oh, I think, can we hear Brianna? Your audio just went out. Can you, I still can't hear you. Okay, you were on a roll, Brianna. So hang on to that thought while you work out your audio. We'll hear from another panelist and we're gonna be sure to come back to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I can share, and Brianna, certainly keep, you know, brainstorming and cut me off as soon as you come back on. But you know, when we think of the data as well, you know, when we've done work with school districts, right, we've you know, meeting with superintendents, meeting with school board members, meeting with senior leadership, it's incredibly helpful to be able to put on the table, you know, this is the percentage of your students who identify as, and this is what their experiences are at school. Because I think that's still one of the biggest misconceptions that we hear from people is, if you ask what percentage of youth do you think identify as, you know, LGBTQ plus, and the numbers are still in single digits, what people think. But when we see these surveys, so, you know, I'm going to reference back the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. In Florida, that number was 18.2. 18.2% of students who said they identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or unsure of their sexual orientation, as well as 1.5% as trans. And in Broward County, which is Fort Lauderdale, for those who aren't familiar with Florida, it was 3.3% of students who identified as trans. And so, you know, it's a lot larger population of students in a given school that we're trying to provide supports for. And yet we can't provide supports if we're not even talking about these students. And so I think that's a big component of why it's important to have that accurate data, is because, you know, if we've already discussed and we already know so many decisions in a school district are data driven, we need to make sure that we are accurately represented in that data too, so that, you know, our experiences are elevated, our needs are expressed, and it comes down to money. The financial investment in supports for our community is also in place. And so if we're able to sit down with a superintendent and say, hey, in your school district, this is the number of kids, every single time there's been quite surprised faces of just how many kids self-identified versus the perception of how many kids self-identify.
You guys able to hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Oh, wait. I think it went away. Hold on, Brianna. Okay, so do whatever trick you just did. Try it again. We still can't hear you.
Yeah.
There. Oh, wait, I just heard you a little bit. Try to unmute and then let's see if we can hear you.
Hello.
There
we
you
go.
are.
Yes.
But is it working? Do I talk fast? It's
You're
No,
good.
no, it's perfect.
You're good.
Okay, I'm gonna try it again.
Okay.
Being a LGBTQ plus of color, knowing our history, there's no telling if the people before us were how we are now. And for the research part of it, that is what makes it important on our community end, just not even being, LGBT. It's just us in general. We didn't have that freedom or honesty that we could show who we want to be or ourselves, or we were, hidden for real. Like we had no way to express if we were even a way to figure it out or how to even get there. So for the research, for those that are watching that are LGBTQ and pro-Black, y'all need to research, do more research, and be part of the research. That it is given, but if you don't do it, then it won't be something to work all around for, so that they can help us also.
Oh, Brianna. Oh, I'm so glad we were able to wait because my whole answer just changed. Definitely coming from a lens that like education should be liberatory and restorative. And, I identify as a Black woman as well. And so to really understand the importance of just truly our stories being heard, right? Like as a woman, as a Black person, and as a member of the LGBTQ community, so much of my history, so much of, our collective contributions to society has been hidden or just purposefully poisoned. And so I think it's just so important that like we get to tell our own stories and that you get to tell their own stories, right? And they're not filtered through the lens of even someone like me or Ian, right? And so I just think that act of lifting your voice and breaking the silence means so much to combat like these real isms, right? Like racism doesn't like to be named, homophobia does not like to be named, misogyny and transphobia does not like to be named. So the more that we continue to really tell our stories and come together, to Ian's point, there will not be or cannot be, hopefully in our future, a leader who says, I care about students and I care about people and I care about liberation, who can ignore the LGBTQ.
Absolutely. Oh, this is getting good. So we're talking about, how important data is to our schools and our districts. We're talking about why it's important to participate and engage in research. I want to hear a little bit more about how you all are using research pertaining to LGBTQ people to inform your organizing strategies. So whether that be you with Equality Florida, Education Consulting, and Nicole, right there with students in your GSA. Brianna, can you talk to us about how you are using research to inform the work that you're doing?
I'm working on my wait time. Okay. I would definitely have to say, just because I am a strong believer, that data is truly, important and research-based design is important. We really use research all throughout of just Kaleidoscope's building of, sessions and training experiences for teachers and education leaders, but also in how we integrate our youth programming. So working with Brianna to bring more GSAs to schools, but to really look at that research, right, around student achievement, around our LGBTQ students' experiences in the classroom, and utilizing that to build experiences in our spaces that truly fill those gaps. So for example, we know that our LGBTQ students really experience larger disparities in employment and just access to leadership development. And so one thing that's really important to us is exposing our LGBTQ students to mentorship and to different pipelines for leadership development, supporting students like Brianna in building out her entire organization. And so I think that's where it goes beyond, oh, wow, this is so sad that 40% of our LGBTQ or 40% of students in the prison pipeline are LGBTQ, to how do we use that data to create a program that completely turns that number around, right, on a systemic level.
To kind of pick off that end with me starting my youth program in a way that not only will the research for me help the program, but it will also help the students around me. We will more likely be the same age, for one. So in that, research would always be like toe to toe majority of the time. And being that I am the research and me giving my feedback, knowing that they will have the similarities, it would just show that like the unit sense of it, like the unity and one to make it become something greater than how small the world is making it seem. That is that's the goal right there.
Doing this work, I think what's so important is the part of the research that we try not to focus on as much is the what the data says related to our kids' experiences. It's something we always talk about, but the part of the data that has been the most helpful in doing this work, and part of that response is because we really want to get from, so we've elevated what the experience of our kids are, now what can you do about it? And so the research that has been incredibly beneficial to what we do and incredibly beneficial in the trainings that are provided is the research that points to what these best practices can do as a result. And so for an example, right, when we talk about trans students and the use of a trans student's affirmed name and pronouns, being able to directly speak to research, and I know there's a lot from UT Austin that's saying when you use a trans person's affirmed name at home, community, school, or even just use a trans person's affirmed name, it can result in a 56% decrease in suicide attempts, right? And so when we're able to make a clear connection of this is what's happening in the school, and this is what you can actually do about it right here, right now, it's really hard to debate that. Or when we talk about GSAs, right? Being able to point to research from the University of British Columbia that says when a GSA is present, not only does suicidal ideation and attempts decrease amongst our LGBTQ plus youth, but also amongst their heterosexual peers. And so it's showing like this is having a clear impact on school climate and on school culture. And so why I think those are so important is because even still, right, I work across the entire state. And so I get calls, crisis calls from families pretty much every week, every other week. And it's from kids, it's from families, and more often than not, it's our trans kids, and it's related to names and pronouns. And in all these calls in the 4 years I've been in this role, Brianna mentioned this at the beginning, which was most people think of, okay, LGBTQ plus youth, bullying and harassment. Well, doing this work, taking those calls on a weekly basis for 4 years, working with kids who have been Baker acted, which means they've, have attempted suicide and have to be transported to a specific facility, all that. Never once has it been because of the other kids in the school. In every single occasion, it has been because of the administrators or the teachers or some other adult in the building that is not being affirming or respecting or in any way, creating that environment where a child feels like they are safe and can learn. And so being able to sit in front of that person and say, listen, this is what the data says. This is what their, our kids' experiences are. And just seeing them for how they see themselves can result in a 56% decrease in suicidal attempts amongst the population where 1 in 2 have attempted suicide. If you don't hear that and get it, right, is this the right profession for you?
Ooh, I don't know about y'all, but I'm like, I have chills. This is such, and I can tell from the chat as well that the folks are really enjoying us getting into this conversation. I think the biggest piece for me is really just appreciating one, Brianna's experiences. As you can tell, kind of we are hearing directly from her perspective, and then we're able to kind of like have a greater conversation about what that means in our work. But I say that to say, we have all been in those shoes. The 4 of us, we've been that, LGB or T or Q youth in the schools. And so it's really helpful to hear what's going on in the present day and how we can continue to support youth based on the data that we collect. So thank you for that. So that brings me to the next question. What do we feel like is missing when it comes to whether it be research or even if we're thinking about policy or programming and that sort of thing? What's missing in terms of LGBTQ people and education?
I can speak first because it's more so happening for my community around my age. Safety has been a major problem. Just far as safety as both physically and verbally. 9 times out of 10, I have guy friends who are in the community and can't be themselves without a harassment or a form of like threat. And it's always overlooked, like, oh, he's just playing, or that's not going to really happen. But on the news, that's not what my friend is seeing when, the trans has been killed, or, being open just to ask a question of like, hey, I'm gay too, or you blah, blah, can be a harmful thing. Just the sexual orientation of people thinking gay means like disgusting, or like you shouldn't be here, or like you don't deserve to be here, in a way that we have already been fighting for years as being oppressed. And that's part of that too, of just not being able to speak, not being able to freely express yourself or get help without still having to have a guard up of like, am I going to be okay after this anyway? So I feel like what's missing or can be included is just actual security. Like that person in particular feels safe, and that will bring more of a like welcoming character, or might want to bring more people and friends, like, hey, this person actually made me feel safe for this program. And if you join, you can feel safe and secure too, and be yourself and all the etc.
So I'm gonna build off of safety, and I appreciate you for sharing that, Brianna, and certainly connections in my head too. We were able to speak with some kids in North Florida, and as adults, a lot of the conversation about safety as it pertains to schools is school hardening and fencing and creating a physical environment that's safer. And when we asked, in school resource officers, all these things, and we asked kids, what's your idea of safety as it pertains to schools? And they said it's hard to sit in a classroom with a teacher who doesn't like you. And that was their version of safety. And so, in Brianna, what you were just kind of talking about, I was picturing that out in the community, but I was also picturing it in an individual classroom, and a child who has to step into that classroom with a teacher who they, don't feel safe in. And so, are they actually going to be able to, stay focused in class or want to be in that class? Or are they going to be more inclined to skip it? Or are they going to be more inclined to, maybe engage in behaviors that does result in, exclusionary discipline? Or how does that now perpetuate that school to prison pipeline? Or is it not, the child is even doing any behavior that's any different from any other kid, but the teacher perceives them as being specifically a discipline issue? And so, that broad vision of what safety looks like, I think is really important, and certainly research around it is critical. I would also add, being able to embed all these things in the existing surveys, I think is important. So schools already do school culture surveys. They already do classroom climate surveys. They already survey their own staff and their students of, what their experience is in school. Why not include demographic questions so you're able to see demographic questions related to, gender identity and sexual orientation. So you're able to actually see what's the experience of specifically those staff members in that same school culture and classroom climate.
Wow, thank y'all so much. Just even my thoughts, right? Building off of safety and, inclusion, is I'm really thinking about, just the importance of mirrors in our schools. So when we do reach the point, or we do have environments where our students feel at the base level, psychologically, physically, and emotionally safe, it is important that we continue to show not just our LGBTQ students, but all students and all families, representations of positive representations of LGBTQ folks and LGBTQ impact. I think that is just, I think that's one of the spaces that Kaleidoscope is truly leaning in, is being able to provide or share more broadly with all of our teachers around what it looks like to bring in our representation into the classroom on an ongoing basis, right? If we're gonna read Romeo and Juliet, what does it look like to bring in, literature that represents the community? To Brianna's point and to Ian's point, where this truly is, a mindset shift. This is a cultural shift. This is a true shift where folks have to start to understand that we are not, off to the side or periphery, but that we are absolutely, at the core of all communities. So really thinking about, again, that piece of safety as well as inclusion, and having those mirrors available at all times, so that not just our LGBTQ students, well, all of our students can truly learn what allyship is like from pre-K, And I think when we spend that time with students during their development, there will be so many things and so many conversations that we will hopefully not be having to have with folks as adults.
I wanted to say one more thing. I feel like I cut Ryan off.
No, go ahead.
With Nicole, like picking back off of what she was saying, yes, the mentalness of this whole agenda is what is driving this whole panel today, as far as the safety, how to properly respect LGBTQ plus. And that aspect of perception, like Ian said, it's always about how we are perceived. We can do everything right in the book and cross all our T's, dot our I's, act respectful, not even talk to anyone. We might just be by ourselves, and someone in a different room or world of however they were raised or their beliefs could ruin the whole perception of that person and make them look like something is wrong with them or the way they carry themselves in particular. To speak on that safety aspect, like what's missing is how we, of course, are helping the LGBTQ plus, but how do we help, like Ian said, the heterosexuals around us too? Like, how do we all come together? Like, yeah. So.
Brianna, thank you for that. I think that I'm right with you, and I think that part of what I was processing is the idea that a lot of times data messes with your, it focuses on your head. Like people can look at data and they get very in their head about it. But I guess the idea of taking data and doing storytelling, because that plays with your heart. And I think that sometimes that combination of having your head and heart in sync, like not only does the data say this, but also I know someone who's experienced this. I think that's when you start to see people change their attitudes and shift, because I think it's not enough for that teacher. And I'm someone who's worked with teachers in my other life. I ran a statewide organization that connected gay straight alliances in high schools and colleges. And so I worked with LGBTQ young people in middle school, high school, and college. And I remember working with some of these teachers who, in all honesty, probably should never have been a teacher because they don't like children. Number one. Number two, getting people to move past just, they'll see data all the time and it doesn't really do anything to them. But it's not until there is someone who's telling their story. And in particular, we had a young trans person who had been going to the largest high school in that state and was consistently picked on, not having their pronouns supported, not being able to use the restroom they wanted. And in particular, that superintendent, that principal, had written her thesis to get her PhD on the importance of dividing people by gender so they can do better in school. And so it really went against her concept of gender. And so you had this young person having to deal with a principal who really was not supporting him. And so it took that young person being brave enough and was willing enough to tell his story in front of the entire population of teachers in that school, and was able to explain what it was like to be transgender in that school. And to see the emotional shift in those teachers who finally understood just the day-to-day hurdles that he had to go through just to exist. I think that, coupled with the data, definitely changed hearts and minds. And so for me, I guess what's missing a lot of times is, and what's one of the things that our institute tries to do, is connect activists with academics, because a lot of times you have academics doing really great research, but the people that can really tell the stories of that data are activists, Brianna, like you, and everybody else on this call, who really try to tell the story of the data. And so I think that's one of the things I think is missing is more storytelling around the data. And also goes back to Ian, something you mentioned before about young people who said, we're not just a statistic. I think it's also about telling the good, the bad, and the good. And I think that there has to be a good balance of that, because we are very resilient. And I'm always impressed by the queer community and how we've been able to maneuver, to rebuild, to restructure, to reframe the narrative. I think that's really important, and that's something that data can do. But to answer your question, Ashlei, I think one of the things that's missing is more development of storytelling.
Yeah, that's really important. And that reminds me of, I know that our last webinar, which is on our website, you can watch the recording, we talked about different types of research, and some of our panelists spoke about qualitative research and how we get stories that way as well. So not just the numbers, but the words and the emotions and the feelings can be really important in driving and fostering like a better community, more safe, more just, and all those things across communities for us. So I'm thinking of our next question. I think Ryan kind of touched on this. If you all could maybe speak to maybe like your experience in working with academics. I think Ian, you're back in school, so maybe you're doing some academic and activist crossover work there. Maybe you can speak to that. But how important is it for academics and researchers to be working like directly with those that are in the community on the ground, like Ryan mentioned, like Brianna, doing that work together to create social justice?
I absolutely think it's paramount. I am about a little bit longer than a decade out of school, but I graduated from Georgia Tech. And, looking back, I am absolutely, grateful to see how being an undergraduate research student at Tech was also, a brand and a way to be an activist itself. I was one of the first researchers who focused specifically on LGBTQ populations, lesbian mothers. And at a school that is honestly all about numbers, all about that code, I was able to conduct an ethnographic research project where, most of the data was these family stories, right? Directly from their mouths, and really being able to bring those stories together to show, a larger social shift was so important. It led me to the work of education and truly bringing that, again, from these institutions to our classrooms, to our streets, to our workplaces, to our homes. And I think that, you know, just to be honest, you know, our society has really, really lauded the academic community. And I think it's definitely time for, you know, us who are doing the work grassroots to truly get on the same level and be able to be in dialogue and at the same tables, so that, to Brianna's point and Ian's point, we can really start to build coalitions and put our expertise together. So that's why I think that collaboration is honestly not a choice. I think it's a necessity for this movement to be sustained.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I am back in school, but it's for urban planning, so it's a little different from what I'm doing now. But I think the big thing and the piece that we're doing that's connected to my work is basically elevating, this is your fight too. And so what I mean by that is, you know, we are working with school districts and trying to get them all, you know, on the same page and supports in place for our students and you know, helping to have training for their teachers and everything else. And so we've kind of taken a couple steps back as that's been successful and continues to grow, to also look at, okay, but where does this start? And are these conversations happening at the teacher prep programs? So that teachers aren't getting into a school district and then trying to understand how to support a trans student. It is, you know, years before, and a part of their teacher prep program is them understanding, hey, you know, when we talk about creating an inclusive environment, this is what we mean. And a lot of our teacher prep programs aren't doing that. They aren't having conversations about LGBTQ plus youth. And, you know, even something that we see, you know, a lot of our rural districts really struggle navigating these conversations. And they rely on our higher ed institutions to be a part of that pipeline of teachers. And they're the ones who, you know, are relying on our higher ed institutions to provide various programming or funding or even auxiliary sites, all these different things. And so that's where it's kind of coming back to, this is your fight too, right? We are struggling to make bridges in our rural communities. You all are already there. And if this is something that's important to you, and if this is something that you truly believe in meeting the needs of every single child, right? Are you having conversations about race? Are you having conversations about class and ability and sexual orientation and gender identity? So these teachers are, you know, a part of this, you know, process of understanding how to create a safe and affirming and inclusive learning environment for every single child.
That's what's up. That's what's up. To piggyback on what he said, yeah, this is our fight too. And this is why I joined in to want to start this youth program, especially in schools, because in schools is where it's starting. It's starting with the students, and being that nobody has, well, back in the day, I know this is all new. Like we said, this is why we're making changes now to make people accustomed to this era in our life. And being that me being young, some kids, you know, mature faster than others. And I have recognized my sexuality at a very, very, very early age. And people have different ages where they come out and come in, or just exploring themselves. And it usually is around the time of high school. So being that I want my program in schools will help that story of how can I help them when they say, oh, my parents don't let me do this or that, and that's how I have a hard time finding myself out or figuring it out myself, or this teacher makes me uncomfortable. Those researches within my youth will help me understand where the problem is and then how to attack it from there. When we say, like, this is our fight too, because, you know, like we say, you don't have a basketball team without a point guard. And if everybody just around shooting the ball with no guidance and no person to really dig down to what the point is, then we will never know what it is. And with the youth, I mean, it starts with us anyway. So when we graduate, when we go to college, when we grow up, if our minds are not right, it is no telling how long it would take. Once you have to get your life together, you won't have time to really see the mental issues that are upheld in this conversation, this problem, and how we can cure it from there with the research and really like fight it. And by that time, you know, in due time, it should really become something beautiful to where we want it to be. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Brianna. And I am right of the mind that, you know, we should be going straight to the source and not, you know, just asking for perceptions of youth, but asking youth directly, you know, what their experiences are. And I think that academia can be a little slow sometimes. But, you know, the time that it takes to prepare for research and conduct the research, collect the data, analyze the data, write about the data, publish the data, disseminate the data. By that point, the research may not be as contemporary as we would like for it to be. And so staying plugged into our communities and specifically our youth can be really, really important. I know that we have about 5 more minutes left, and we did just get a question in the chat box, and I wanted to share that with our panel for maybe like a rapid response kind of thing. But the question is, what do we say to professors, so academics, who don't keep LGBTQ people central to their work as they would maybe other minoritized populations such as Black and Indigenous people, colored, disabled people, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, what does that look like? What do we say to those professors who don't centralize LGBTQ people in the research? Maybe I think Glsen mentioned it, maybe they feel like it's not worthy of discussion, or only talking about just basic inclusion.
That one hit my soul. The one word that I think we use so often as a buzzword, intersectionality. It is a buzzword, but it is not just a word, it is true lived experience. So I just kind of want to put myself in a place of vulnerability, where I have had teachers, I have had principals that I've worked for, I have had colleagues truly interact with me in a way where I have had to choose between my Blackness or my womanness or my LGBTQness. And I think, you know, that same type of mindset on an interpersonal level proliferates on a systemic level. And I think it's important that we understand that I feel like in many cases, we all are they, right? Like we hold multitudes of identities, and there is no way to center BIPOC folks if you don't center folks living with disabilities and folks who are LGBTQ and folks who are of, you know, more expansive genders, because to be Black is also to be gay and also, you know, to be of other identities. And I think it is a completely false narrative that you can, you know, choose where to put the spotlight, because these parts of us truly create a whole, and they cannot be separated.
Absolutely, Nicole. And just the example I thought about that kind of connects, you know, in a school setting, that's the exact same, you know, scenario, I think, is when we talk about GSAs, you know, on many occasions, we will do a training for GSA sponsors, Gender and Sexuality Alliance or Gay Straight Alliance. And what we'll hear is a sponsor will come up and say, hey, you know, my GSA is almost predominantly white, you know, what's going on? And so the conversation that we have is, you know, just because you're saying you're creating a safe space for LGBTQ plus youth doesn't mean all LGBTQ plus youth feel like that's a space for them. And so, you know, I think that's very similar to the, you know, question that was posed. And it is, you know, to your point, Nicole, you know, it is the importance of looking at people's identities much more broadly, and you know, really trying to understand that we're not, you know, we're not talking about singular identities. We're really trying to talk about, you know, how to create spaces, or how to, you know, create environments that are affirming for all parts of an individual. And so, you know, that was the kind of connection that I instantly thought of when I read the question and then what you were sharing, Nicole.
All right. So wanted to thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Brianna. And thank you, Ryan, for your contributions as well. As we can tell from the chat, this has been a very dynamic and really helpful conversation. I'm talking about LGBTQ folks in the education space. I wanted to pass it back to Ryan for some closing words.
Sure. Thank you, Ashlei. I'm just going to get this slide pulled up here. So I want to thank our panelists. I wasn't expecting to be so moved about education and research and organizing, but this conversation definitely moved me in terms of what we all have experienced and what we're hoping to get out of making sure academics and activists are doing more together. And so again, thank you to all of our panelists for being remarkable in what you do, for being brave and being resilient. And with that, I just wanted to remind folks that the LGBTQ Institute, along with Emory University, is conducting our second survey of LGBTQ Southerners. And we would love to have you all who are on this, this webinar help promote the survey and take the survey if you can. You can go to lgbtqsouthernsurvey.org to take the survey. And we use the hashtag, same hashtag, to promote it as well. But just really appreciate you all being here today. And if you can help promote that survey, going towards the conversation we had today to that end, we would really appreciate that. But again, thank you all so much. And we hope that you will join us next time for our next webinar that we'll be having on, I believe, August 25th at 3 p.m. And you can register at lgbtq-symposium.org. And in that conversation, we're going to be doing a deeper dive on research and campaigns focused on LGBTQ people and employment. So that I'm sure will be a really interesting conversation as well. You can also follow us on any of our social handles, as you can see, our Instagram and Facebook. But again, thank you all for being here today. And we really appreciate the work that you all do. And thanks to our viewers as well. So hopefully we'll see you on August 25th. Thank you so much.